is, so what are ways that we can mitigate those losses? That's another thing that comes up is, well, you shouldn't spread because you're either, leaving, a certain amount that's going to be left on the surface or volatilized or lost in the spring, whatever the case is. So what are ways that we can, mitigate if we are fall applying and spring applying broadcast? Yeah, what are ways that we can mitigate that?
Yeah, it's like a lot of things we can do, right? And in most cases, there's a right and a wrong way to do things, and so we do need to utilize all the tools available to us to make it most efficient. And so, I mean, one thing obviously is to work around the weather as much as we can, right? The ideal situation is always to spread your nitrogen before a rain and allow that rain to move it into the soil where it will be much, much safer from any potential losses. So that's the first one. Most people are pretty familiar with that is a rain after spreading is ideal. And really from a time frame perspective, it depends a bit on conditions, but really if you can get a rain within a week, you're in really good shape. And, within a few days would be absolutely ideal. Now, of course, that
And doing that,
is
sorry, and doing that more so in the spring. Like if you're
yeah,
looking
that
for that rain.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For the most part, that comment applies mostly to spring or in-season application. Is trying to get a rain on it. It doesn't typically come into play in the fall for a couple of reasons. And then the other thing too, in terms of the weather, is if we are looking at fall spreading specifically, is timing that application as much as possible. So for example, not spreading too early in the spring. Really, what you want your soils to be cooled down. We typically say surface soil conditions in that 5 degrees Celsius or less is ideal. And there's some very specific reasons for that. It goes back to, guys who have done anhydrous in the past often heard the same thing, is you don't want to apply your anhydrous too early in the fall. And really the reasons are pretty similar in that is that your potential for losses are reduced through the winter and the first part of early spring is if you can delay that application till soil is cooled down a bit. And then one that's a bit harder to do, but ideally if you can put it on before the soil is frozen solid as well. So there's kind of a real sweet spot there. Soil's cooled down, but not quite frozen yet. That would be ideal, but that one's often hard to hit. That's a small window and we often don't get that. But the most important thing is not to be too early in the fall. And if you are going to push it on the early side, there's some ways to kind of help with that. But timing that it helps you as well. So the biggest tools in our toolbox that are completely under control are some inhibitors, some additives we can put on our fertilizer to help reduce losses. And really talk about those, we need to talk a little bit about the nitrogen cycle. We'll try not to get too in depth in it, but really it's hard to talk about them without looking at the nitrogen cycle a little bit. So I've shared my screen here. I have the nitrogen cycle in front of us when it comes to the fertilizer we apply to the soil. And there's really a couple of main potential for losses. So of course, here's the urea that we apply in the soil. Don't have to worry too much about the chemical structure of it, but the important thing is this is what the urea, when we put on the soil, through a process called hydrolysis, which is aided by and really performed by the urease enzyme here. Our urea is converted into ammonia. And this is our first big potential for a loss. So chemically, this is the same as the anhydrous ammonia we put down. So of course, you can imagine anhydrous ammonia has the tendency to gas off, right? And so we really don't want our nitrogen to sit in this form for very long, particularly on the soil surface where we've applied our urea. And so this is where our first inhibitor comes in, called the urease inhibitor, which what it does, it inhibits this enzyme. So when we apply a urease inhibitor to our nitrogen, our urea, before we apply it to the soil surface, really what it's doing is it's inhibiting this process, holding the urea in this form longer. That doesn't mean it holds it in the physical form of a granule of urea, but chemically it's held in this form. It may dissolve and move into the soil and disappear from you, from your site, but chemically it's still in this form, which is relatively stable on the soil surface. So really what we're doing is we're trying to hold it in this form, move it into the soil before we move through this. And then as that inhibitor wears off, hopefully we've had some moisture to move it into the soil and it can move through this ammonia form where it's unstable and into the ammonium form. And that's really, when we talk about fall application of anhydrous or of urea, any type of nitrogen, our number one goal is to overwinter in the ammonium form. That's our most stable form. It can hold onto the soil. It won't leach. It won't gas off. That's really our goal, is to hold it in this form as much as possible through the winter, and that's ideal. The next form of loss, if it makes it this far, or when it makes it this far, is in nitrite or nitrate, which is really, this process happens naturally in the soil. There's nothing we have to do to aid it or anything. And so what we're doing, in some cases, we're trying to hold it in this ammonium form. So you'll notice these two conversions are really similar. They happen by bacteria in the soil. And so what's important about that is that's a living organism in the soil. And of course, living organisms in the soil have a temperature range in which they operate in. And so these bacteria that convert out of the ammonium stage into our nitrites and nitrates, those are bacteria. And that's really where that 5-degree requirement comes from. If we can wait till the soil is below 5 degrees, these bacteria are very inactive. And when we apply our urea, if it makes it through to our ammonium form, or when it does, if our soil is cool enough, it greatly reduces or eliminates this conversion until the spring when things warm up. And so then we can overwinter in this form. So that's really important in terms of timing it. Now we do have, we've got two main families of inhibitors and treatments that we can put on our fertilizer. Of course, the first is the urease inhibitors, which are known as NBBTs or duramides, and they inhibit this form. And then the next one is the nitrification inhibitors, which are typically DCDs and DMPP, and they inhibit this one. And so depending on what we're trying to do, depending on our timing and everything, we'll use either one of those or a combination of the two. And that gets a little more in depth to dig into those, but really using some form of inhibitor and picking the right inhibitor for the job you're trying to do. In my mind, it's not even optional when it comes to spreading nitrogen. I usually tell guys the only way I will be a fan and will get behind spreading bare urea is if it's one of those years where it rains every other day. And when they say 90% chance of rain, it's 90% chance of rain, and it's going to happen. But I've also seen it where guys spread it, there's 90% chance of rain 3 days away. And then by the time that day comes, the rain has disappeared and we've got bare urea sitting on the soil with, and at that point, it's really, there's no way to know how much we're losing or how much we've lost. There are some measurements you can do, but it's really hard to quantify until you wait till the end of the year. So at the end of the day, there are things we can do to make urea safer to broadcast, and we absolutely should be doing them when we're broadcasting urea. And the other thing about these products too, the ones I've spoke about in particular, so the trade names of the products I've talked about would be the urease inhibitors would be things like Agritane, RMU, Contain. There's a few different ones like that are all different types of urease inhibitors. And then, products like Super U or RMU Advanced are products that use a combination of the urease inhibitor and the nitrification inhibitors. And so really picking the right product for the job is really important. And I think someday will be a requirement really in terms of the laws and what's required to be able to spread nitrogen.